Hi everyone. Is the mic audible to everyone? Okay, great, thanks. My name is Vishwesha. I'm also at the Center for Ecological Sciences at Indian Institute of Science. Today I'm going to talk about collective movement and evolution of cooperation in this context. So I will. Of various things our lab is interested in. We are interested in understanding collective movement of various types of organisms. I'm showing a video of fish that are actually in the lab, and we are not doing anything to them, and they show these types of fairly spectacular patterns. So some problems that we are interested in this context is to understand, are there simple mathematical descriptions of this self-organization? The second type of questions we are interested is the inverse question. So here we want to construct mathematical models that explain the patterns. In the second type of problems, we are given real data of the type I showed you in the previous video. Can we construct the mathematical models that describe those type of patterns, and what are the general principles of collective behavior? The problem that I'm going to talk about today is that why do organisms even show collective behavior at all? So this is the problem, and this is largely theoretical work, and I'm going to focus on one such work which was done by Jaideep Joshi, who was a PhD student in our lab. So I thought I will acknowledge before I forget to do so. And part of the work was also done in collaboration with Simon Levin and Ian Cousin, and these are the funding agencies. So let me explain the dilemma of cooperation, which some of you are already familiar with and may have already been covered in this workshop. So cooperation is basically an action where the actor pays a cost to himself or herself while benefiting the recipient of the action. And clearly, I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, this is not something that benefits the actor in terms of the fitness, and therefore classic evolutionary models show that this cooperation is unstable to invasion by defectors who do not show these behaviors. So how do we understand this mathematically? We understand them using simple game theoretic framework. So C here represents cooperation. If a cooperator interacts with another cooperator, both of them get a benefit of B minus C. B is the benefits of the interaction, whereas C is the cost. On the other hand, if a cooperator meets a defector who doesn't participate in these interactions, cooperator only gets the cost, meaning a negative payoff associated with the interaction. So therefore, it's always better to be a defector, irrespective of what the opponent does. You know, if you are a defector, you will always do better than a cooperator. So if you are a defector, if the other person is cooperator, you have a benefit B, and if the other is also a defector, you know, of course nobody gains anything. So it's always better to be a defector. And so given this, why do we find cooperation in various types of organisms has been a question of interest in many a lot of models as well as empirical systems. So one such solution for this problem is called spatial assortment. The idea is that, so this is a simulation picture showing two types of phenotypes. Let us say blue here represents cooperators and the red represents the defectors. If cooperators and defectors are spatially segregated, then cooperators on an average interact more among themselves. Right? So therefore, everybody among cooperation gets benefits. On the other hand, if defectors are just interacting among themselves, then none of them are getting any payoffs. So as long as B is greater than C, spatial assortment of cooperators and defectors solves this puzzle of cooperation. So what might be happening in nature is that cooperators figure out some mechanisms to sort of stay away from defectors, and therefore they don't get invaded by defection. Okay, that's the solution. But these type of spatial structures require that the system does not mix too much. For example, in these simulations, these particles really do not move, and these might be applicable for some microbial systems where the mobility is very small. If you think of high organisms, this is to sort of say the same thing in mathematical terms. If there is spatial assortment, the average payoff of cooperators will be greater than those of defectors. Therefore, cooperators can sustain. Okay. On the other hand, if you think of many higher organisms, many of them exhibit pretty high degree of mobility. And mobility ensures that cooperators and defectors are constantly interacting with one another. And therefore, typically it is thought that mobility destroys these kind of assortments. And in fact, if we take these kind of models and implement mobility, and in fact it does happen, and therefore the classic sort of assumption is that mobility destroys assortment. And what we are basically showing in, what basically Jaideep showed in his thesis work is that, no, that's not necessarily always true. If we account for co-evolutionary dynamics, how grouping and assortment actually happens. And in fact, what he showed was that cooperation and grouping can co-evolve even in mobile populations and yet maintain assortment. So I'm basically going to show the base summary of these results. So how do we do this? We sort of build a computational model of individuals that move through space. Now, in these models, every individual is moving in a two-dimensional continuous space, and they have certain at every point in time they have a position and an orientation. And when they are moving, typically through random walks, they might also interact with other individuals who are also moving. And when they do move and meet other individuals, they have a tendency to group. So this is one basic interaction we incorporate. So these are called individual-based spatially explicit models. And we have, for simplicity, restricted ourselves to 2 dimensions. And these mobile individuals can have 2 costly traits. And so we call them flocking interaction, meaning when 2 individuals are sufficiently close to each other, they have a tendency to sort of copy each other's direction. And as a consequence, they form groups. In addition, they can also choose to cooperate or defect. So there are 2 independent axes of traits, and they can evolve independently. And typical models of cooperation do not co-evolve them. They assume just flocking and then think of cooperation, but they often do not account for spatial dynamics of flocks. And even when they do, they assume that the flock they're doing is that we assume that these 2 can both evolve together. So I'm going to show you some, I think I may have to go there and make a click. So how do these simulations look like? So this is a simulation where there are no RS0 means the flocking interactions are 0, therefore individuals are just randomly walking in the space. And when this RS, the flocking interactions, they form many groups, and these groups also merge and split among themselves. And when this RS or the flocking index is very high, then they actually form very large groups. Okay. And we considered another type of movement model where, in these type of models, individuals have self-propelled. They are like fish or locusts or organisms which have self-propulsion. But if you think of microbial systems, they are often driven in highly fluid media where their own mobility might be not very important. So we considered one extreme where individuals do not have their own mobility, but they are moved by the media they are present in. And so basically these are like particles in some turbulent medium. In physics, they're also called tracer particles. So on the background, there is a medium that's turbulent simulation. And depending on the stickiness of individuals, they may or may not form groups. So we consider 2 types of models. And in the first type of model, the flocking interactions could evolve along with cooperation. In the second type of model, the stickiness parameter between individuals can evolve along with cooperation. Okay. Okay, so let's come back to the 2 traits. And then if you think of these as 2 traits, then there are 4 possible trait combinations. Sure. They can spontaneously separate out, as you saw in those videos. They can spontaneously separate out. So that is true. So we don't fix the group in anywhere in space. Okay. Yeah. You do have to detect other individuals. And if you think of, so there are 2 reasons. If you think of higher organisms, when you are in groups, you are sharing resources. So resources come down per capita as group size increases. Or if you are a microbial organism, the modality of interaction themselves might be costly. Those are all happening spontaneously. So I'm not, explicitly modeling formation or deformation. I'm modeling processes at the level of individuals here, because when the selection happens, selection has to happen at the level of individuals. So the modeling is therefore individual based, because of the interactions. Formation, deformation are all emergent properties in the model. So I'm not discarding any of them. Okay. Yeah. So one simplified way of thinking about this system is, this actually has a much bigger phase space, because both of them are continuous states. But to sort of make our life easy, we can think of them as 4 extreme cases. You don't evolve either of these. Basically, I'm a solitary individual who is random walking, and I'm also a defector. This is the least costly trait because there is no cost associated with it at all, right? I could also be a solitary cooperator or a flocking defector and flocking cooperator. So this is in some sense the costliest behavior, except that if you are flocking and if you are also cooperating, you also get the benefit of cooperation by being in flocks, okay? So in terms of cost alone, this is the costliest one, but there are also potentially high benefits. But if we again use those game theoretic arguments, the basic idea here is that the moment you have flocking cooperators, defectors can take over the entire population. So this is an unstable strategy. Okay, that's the basic idea. Now, can we still maintain flocking cooperators? So I'm not forcing it. I just want to see whether the evolution will take you there. So in well-mixed populations, this will be unstable, although it has very potentially high benefits, and this will be the stable strategy. So what we do is, we do these kind of simulations which simulate group formation, reproduction, mutation, and dispersal. How does this work? We start with a large population where both the traits are 0, and then we let them move around, and they, depending on the, so of course we can start with 0, but because of spontaneous interaction, sometimes they randomly form groups, and if we did not start with 0 traits, they can of course form groups. And we simulate this process, and then when the groups are formed towards the end of this simulation, we calculate how much was the payoff that each individual gained because of the payoff matrix I described. There is a costly cooperation, there is a costly flocking behavior, but sometimes when they are together, there are also benefits. So we calculate all these for the group structure and type species structure, and then depending on those payoffs, every individual reproduces with a probability which is higher if the payoff was higher. And then when the reproduction happens, there are the mutations, and then they disperse to random locations. And this is very crucial. The classic models of cooperation in space assume local dispersal. We assume that the dispersal is random, and then the entire process repeats. Okay, there is a generation after generations where the traits are changing, and then we want to see where will the evolution take. Okay, and then so just to sort of remind you, this model allows for a cooperative tendency and a cohesive tendency, and in a well-mixed system, this must be the stable strategy. So this is what we really find. We find that we also vary the parameter speed. Okay, what you find surprisingly is that as a function of the mobility parameter, the evolution, the cooperators actually increase and then eventually decrease. In fact, there is a fairly large range of, so this is the curve that you must be really looking at, and there's a fairly large parameter value. This is really a log scale of speed, which we often think of as causing well mixing and therefore destroy cooperation, but actually it favors cooperation. And what we also find is that, the increase in cooperation also coincides with increase in this cohesive tendency. Okay, so there is a coevolution of cooperation together with flocking behavior. And if you look at the spatial structure, this is how this looks like. The red individuals here represent defectors. The blue individuals represent cooperators. If you observe this behavior, it's evident that the cooperators are actually forming groups, whereas defectors are not really forming groups. And that's the key to mechanism of what sustains cooperation in this. I will come to that later. But we find exactly sort of very similar patterns even in the turbulent model, where the individuals don't move, but the medium under them actually moves them around. Okay, so what's really happening? What is causing assortment? At the end of the day, cooperation can happen only if there is assortment. Okay, so what's really happening is that
the cooperators and defectors in the model do not evolve to have the exact same cohesion or these flocking tendencies. In fact, what we find is that they actually have a different value of this strength of flocking behavior, and as a function of this difference, as the more is the difference, more is the assortment. Okay, so in this model, this differential cohesion spontaneously emerges. I did not put it in the model, and then as a consequence, cooperators and defectors are actually separated out. So I'm going to show you a few videos to demonstrate this. So okay, I think there's some problem with the first video. So this is a turbulent medium. This is a scenario where in the first scenario there is no, both the individuals have same type of cohesion. Therefore, it's hard. I mean, the other one was better, but for some reason it is not really playing. But what actually happens is that they evolve to have different types of cohesion parameters, because of which cooperators and the defectors who are in red, they actually spontaneously separate out in space, despite the fact that there is a strong medium that is mixing the entire system. Okay, so one way to understand this is using multi-level selection framework, where the idea is that because cooperators are all in groups and defectors are not, we can think of the system as having many groups, where within each group cooperators are at a disadvantage. However, a group of cooperator is actually better than a group of defectors. Okay, and this is called multi-level selection interpretation. And in fact, we mathematically showed in the paper that this is exactly equal to even what is called inclusive fitness interpretation. Okay, so now we then developed an analytical model that sort of tries to disentangle these mechanisms a bit better and makes predictions. And we considered basically these 4 extreme traits: flocking cooperators, solitary cooperators, total flocking individuals, and total cooperators. And what we do is basically we think of individuals as stochastically choosing between these strategies, and then we wrote down a series of chemical reaction-like equations, and from them we can construct the way stochastically these populations are evolving. I won't go into all the details, basically when we write down equations for how cooperators who are solitary, cooperators who are flocking, and the total number of cooperators in the populations change, we find that in the equation selection, effect of mutations, and that of drift very nicely separate out into 3 different components in the equation. And we can actually take this fairly complex set of equations to just understand how cooperations change over time. And surprisingly, this looks like this. P is the proportion of cooperators in the population that changes as a function of P into 1 minus P times RB minus C. And for those of you who are familiar with the idea of kin selection, this equation remarkably looks similar to Hamilton's rule. So cooperators increase in population when RB is greater than C. So what are these RB terms? Surprisingly, this R is a measure of assortment, and in fact we found that this measure of assortment is exactly equal to difference in flocking tendency of cooperators and defectors. In other words, differential cohesion, as we called in the previous system. Okay, so and what's interesting is typically in evolutionary game theory models we look for an ESS, which is a steady state. Here we never reach a steady state. In fact, there are cycles, and these are results of analytical models. Those of simulations, they match perfectly well, all with the story that in this system cooperators and defectors evolve to have different strategies. Cooperators are slightly stronger in terms of their flocking behavior compared to defectors, because of which there is an assortment. Okay, so with that sort of story, so I want to conclude that using this model we showed that even in organisms that exhibit high degree of mobility, they can have cooperation, and despite mixing between groups, cooperators and defectors can stay separate and remain assorted because of this differential interaction. And we were able to use a fairly complicated individual-based spatial model as well as analytical model to show that this mechanism is consistent. So with that, I would like to thank, and for those who are interested, this paper has the computational part of the work, but the following analytical model is still being written up. So again, thanks to Jaideep for all the excellent work. Yeah, thanks to all of you for